Lauren Boebert has always been a little nutter butter, but she's going completely off the rails at this point. Check out this new clip from Lauren Boebert where she's talking about the Constitution, separation of church and state, and how she feels about them.
The reason we had so many overreaching regulations in our nation is because the church complied.
The reason we have so many overreaching regulations in the U.S. is because the church complied. Interesting. Inherent in that statement is the idea that the church is automatically far right and anti-regulation. She's already setting up an image of what she believes the church to be and excluding any churches that don't fit in with that view. Any churches that are pro-LGBT, any churches that are pro-choice or love people rather than hate them, they're not real churches. She's automatically setting things up to be viewed that way. Not even going down the route of Muslim churches, not even talking about Jewish churches. We're talking strictly Christian churches here. She has a very specific, narrow view of what a church is. If it doesn't fall into that category, it isn't a real church in her view.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it.
That is just simply not true. That's a simply disturbing level of Christian nationalism in my mind. The church is supposed to direct the government.
And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
Okay, that's interesting. So what is the separation of church and state is my question. What does that mean? What does she mean it was in a stinking letter, quote unquote? We're going to get into exactly what that means, and we're going to talk about where the term came from and what the founding fathers actually intended. Separation of church and state is a term that I think was coined by Thomas Jefferson, right? The Constitution has something called the Establishment Clause in it. And the Establishment Clause is in the First Amendment. Let's just read it. This is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is the section we're talking about right here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's specifically what the Constitution says. Now, the Supreme Court is there to interpret what the Founding Fathers meant or intended, or interpret the Constitution to give us more rights or protect us from the government generally. The Constitution is supposed to be a permission slip. What is the government allowed to do? In this case, it's laying out pretty specifically that the government is not supposed to regulate religion or get involved in religion in any way, right? We don't have to wonder what the Founding Fathers meant in this case, because we know exactly what they meant. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Danbury Baptist Church explaining exactly what the First Amendment meant and what it was about and what it was for and how it was supposed to be interpreted and all of that stuff. So I wanted to just kind of read through the letter to Danbury Baptist Church in Connecticut. This is on Politico. Title is Jefferson Signs Danbury Letter, January 1st, 1802. So that was, when was the Constitution ratified? Is that 1787? 1788 is when it was ratified. So this is 14 years after the Constitution was ratified. That's when the letters to Danbury were written and signed. Let's read this article and see what it says here. President Thomas Jefferson, writing to members of Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut on this day in 1802, stated that the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution created a wall of separation between church and state. That's where the term came from. The association had been founded in 1790 as a coalition of about 26 churches in the Connecticut Valley. Its leaders had written to Jefferson to complain that Connecticut's official religion, Calvinist Protestants, had founded the colony, infringed on their own religious liberty. Whatever religious privileges we enjoy, they maintained, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. So there was a state religion. The state was pushing a religion down people's throats, and it was a Calvinist Protestant religion that was doing it at the time. And Danbury Baptist felt like they were hoping that the Constitution was going to protect their right to practice their religion freely and not be interfered with by the Calvinist Protestants who were running the government in Connecticut at the time. Let's keep reading. Jefferson did not offer the group any explicit help in overturning the Connecticut law, except to say that he expects to see the progress of those sentiments of religious freedom. The state did away with its official religion in 1818, so that was 16 years after these letters. However, he sympathized with the Connecticut Baptists, writing, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duty." So there was a state religion in Connecticut. The other religious groups in the area didn't like that, and they set out to try to prevent religion from getting involved in government anymore. This is a Baptist church that tried to do this and succeeded. That's what the Founding Fathers believed. They didn't want religion involved in government at all. She says it's a stinking letter. No, it's the Constitution, and that's what the Constitution writers meant when they wrote it. It's like her just dismissing one of our rights. It's like her just completely ignoring a piece of the Constitution. The Constitution says we have a right to protection from unreasonable search and seizure. It's like her saying, it's in a stinking letter. That part of the Constitution doesn't even matter. No, it does. It does matter. That's a right. This is a line that the Constitution says the government cannot cross. This is part of that permission slip. The government is barred from searching us unless it's reasonable, unless there's some specific good reason to do so. The government is barred from jailing us for expressing our free speech. The government's also not allowed to incorporate religion into it. It's not allowed to force religious views on anybody. It has to stay perfectly neutral. That is part of the Constitution. That's the point here. And in that spirit of remaining completely neutral, it's allowed to prevent religion from forcing its will upon other people. So it is allowed to regulate religion if it's to prevent religion from forcing its will on others. It's not just in a stinking letter. It's part of the Constitution. It's part of our unalienable rights that were specified when the Constitution was written. So here's my question. Where did this come from? Listen to this claim she makes here.
Tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution.
Where did that come from? Where did she hear that in the first place? Separation of church and state isn't in the Constitution? Yes, it is. Those specific words aren't in the Constitution. It's called the Establishment Clause, but separation of church and state is used to describe the Establishment Clause. So where did that idea come from? I've heard this from like a billion people. Josh Mandel was his political candidate. He said the exact same thing.
We should be instilling faith in the classroom, in the workplace, and everywhere in society. The secular left, the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, a lot of these Soros-funded organizations, they advance the argument that the separation of church and state exists, and for that reason you can't teach kids about religion. My personal feeling is there's no such thing as separation of church and state. The framers of the Constitution envisioned a country where in the classroom, kids would learn about God.
Josh Mandel was running against J.D. Vance in Ohio, and he lost. J.D. Vance won. Now I remember. J.D. Vance isn't much better, but that's beside the point. So my question is, where did this idea come from? That the separation of church and state isn't even in the Constitution. I have traced it back to this guy named David Barton. If you're unfamiliar with David Barton, this is him on screen right here. This guy is mentioned by Kent Hovind through his entire seminar series. If you haven't seen the seminar series, I've been going through it on my Telltale Unfiltered channel lately. Give it a watch. It's kind of interesting, I think. The link is in the description if you want to see it. But Kent Hovind talks about David Barton like a lot. As it turns out, he pretends to be a constitutional scholar. He is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a constitutional scholar. Like, not at all. But listen to this. June 1st, 2016. As far as I can tell, this is where the claim originated. Not from 2016, but he's been saying something similar for decades. Since like the 90s, basically. Listen to this.
So say there's some religious activity in public. Maybe somebody wants to pray over their lunch at school and they're told they can't do that. And they say, oh, you can't do that because of separation of church and state.
Okay, somebody wants to pray over their lunch at school and they're told they can't because of separation of church and state. Now, that doesn't make any sense. If somebody wants to pray over their lunch at school, whether it's a teacher or a student or anybody at all, they're perfectly free to. Nobody's stopping them. The separation of church and state does not prevent them from praying in school. Do what you want to do. What you can't do is lead students in prayer as a representative of the government. That would be a violation of the separation of church and state. But see, he wants to take something that is innocuous and not a big deal and nobody cares and turn it into this big thing. The movie God's Not Dead did the exact same thing. That whole movie was based on a faulty premise. If you're unfamiliar with God's Not Dead, it's like Christian persecution porn, basically. This teacher is asked a specific question in history class about a specific biblical verse, and the teacher answers the student in context. That's not against the law at all. That's perfectly fine. But God's Not Dead, in that movie, the big evil ACLU comes after the innocent Christian who wasn't doing anything wrong to anybody, and she gets sued and just all kinds of crazy stuff. Anyways, that's what he's doing here. He's taking something that's not against the law at all. That's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Pray if you want. Go ahead. Go nuts. And he's making it out to be this big point of persecution like you're not allowed to. Nobody said you weren't allowed to pray. You're perfectly allowed to pray anytime. Just don't lead students in prayer. That's the problem.
Because of separation of church and state. Is that what separation of church and state really means? They will say yes.
No, it's not at all. I'm they, and I say no, that's not what separation of church and state is.
Yes, here's the way you respond. Number one, where does that phrase come from? And when they say the Constitution, you say, would you please read it for me? Because when they go there, they'll never find it. It does not appear anywhere in the Constitution.
Yeah, see, this is his whole bit. He wants to pretend that it's not in the Constitution at all. It is actually in the Constitution. That specific phrase is used to refer to the Establishment Clause. Separation of church and state is a reference to something else, to the specific part of the Constitution we're talking about. Nice little trick you tried to pull on us there, David.
And the second thing you do is, wait, we just read the Constitution. It says Congress shall make no law. How does a kid praying over their lunch mean the same as Congress making a law?
It has nothing to do with that. That's why kids are perfectly free to pray over their lunch. He didn't even go the teacher route. Like if he had said teachers aren't allowed to pray over their lunches, that would have been a little more difficult because students are not representatives of the government, but teachers are. So it would make it a little bit trickier, but still not against the law. Teachers are allowed to pray if they want. They just can't lead students in prayer. Something that was overturned by the Supreme Court recently, by the way. I forget the name of the case. Kennedy v. something. It was recently decided that teachers are allowed to lead students in prayer, which is a disgusting violation of a power imbalance. But, I'm not here to talk about that. Let's just continue listening.
And the third thing you ask them is, and by the way, if praying over your lunch is so bad, why did we do it for 180 years under the Constitution?
We're still doing it. Nobody is prevented from praying over your lunch. They've been doing it for longer than 180 years. They've been doing it since day one, since the Constitution was written. 1787, I think, is when it was written. 235 years, not 180. Get it right, David.
And it's only been in recent years that we have not done that. Did we just invent separation of church and state? No, it's been there from the beginning, but we've twisted it to mean something that it doesn't mean. So if you ask them those three questions, you can win your argument.
I mean, I just debunked every single one of those arguments. It's just completely ridiculous. And the sad thing about this is this guy's been saying this thing, like I said, since the 90s. He's been saying this since the 90s. Not only does he claim to be a constitutional scholar, which, again, is incorrect. As far as I know, he doesn't have a degree in anything at all. Yeah, the guy just writes books. That's it. He just writes books. He's an author. He's not a constitutional scholar. He received a Bachelor's of Arts degree in religious education from Oral Roberts University, a religious school, in 1976. That's it. He doesn't have a law degree, doesn't have anything. He has a 4-year degree from a Christian university, ultra-Christian university, and he's masquerading as a constitutional scholar. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So anyway, I think that's probably likely the source, the original source of the claim that there is no separation of church and state in the Constitution. It's nonsense. Oh, and I love the little outro here, wall builders, fantastic. This is a pervasive view within Christianity, not just about the separation of church and state not existing, but the idea that Christians should be controlling government in general. This has been a part of evangelicalism for a while now. This is Tony Spell. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he made a big splash when he refused to keep his church safe during the pandemic, refused to close down no matter what, refused to go virtual, refused to even hold it outside, refused to take the most basic precautions because he just simply doesn't care about his people's lives, I guess. I don't know. He also got himself in hot water by attempting to run over a protester that was at his church. He got arrested for that. Anyway, a long story short, this guy is a complete nutcase, and he had something to say on this subject recently, too. Listen to this one. This is from mid-April 2022. Check this out.
The past 24 months has been a spiritual battle. We have been invaded from hell itself to destroy the greatest nation on earth. And where did they start? They started with the churches. Let's close the churches.
Yeah, he's a mega church pastor, thousands of attendees, and refused to take even the most basic precautions for the pandemic, the most basic stuff. Wouldn't ask them to wear masks, wouldn't space the chairs out, wouldn't hold service outside, wouldn't hold it on Zoom, wouldn't do anything.
Let's silence the voices of the prophets. And it should be in the United States of America, the prophet, the priests, the prince, and the people.
Prophets, priest, prince, people, i.e., himself being a prophet of God, he believes that he receives divine information from God himself. He is supposed to be passing that information down to like the deacons and stuff in the church, and the deacons pass it down to the government, and the government bases laws on the stuff that the priests are getting from the prophets. And then the people get that information from the government. So he has this very specific idea of the church hierarchy and the governmental hierarchy and how it should operate. The people are at the bottom, the church is at the top. Just like Lauren Boebert. This is a disturbing level of Christian nationalism, and it is spreading.
Isaiah talks about that. There is a divine order. God says, I want to speak to my prophet. He's going to speak to my priests. And then the princes, that's governing bodies. And then the people. Well, today, everything is upside down. You have the people controlling the government.
The people, wow. So I guess he doesn't believe in a government for the people, by the people, huh? Tell me you don't like the Constitution without telling me you don't like the Constitution.
The government controlling the priests who have silenced the prophets. America's in trouble today. America's in trouble with God.
Yeah, so that's Tony Spell. Point is, this view is seeping through the American system right now. America was colonized by people who didn't want to be oppressed by the British religious authorities anymore. A lot of people came to America for religious freedom. They didn't want to be part of the state religion in Britain. And part of the reason they were not so well liked in Britain was because many of them were religious extremists. They were nutcases. We can see the results of that now. We can see the results of religious extremists coming over here, or so many religious rejects, effectively, right? They were rejected by the standard church at the time, so they came here for religious freedom, and we can now see the results of them taking power. Disturbing stuff, man. Disturbing stuff. The Founding Fathers were correct to tell people they can't be involved in government. Don't push your way into government. Don't try to regulate anything. There are people of all different backgrounds in the United States, and they all pay taxes, so they all have a right to practice their religion freely. But once you start forcing your religion on the government, that's when we need to draw a line. The Founding Fathers were correct on that point. Hank Kunneman seems to be of the same mind. Listen to this one. This one is from late November 2021.
God is anointing those that are standing up with an incredible boldness and an authority. And yet we still have immature Christians who you say something bold or something that touches on politics, and they don't think, well, that shouldn't be mentioned in the church. And my question is, well, then where do you really think that you're going to hear the truth about the culture or about what's happening in your government? Do you think you're going to hear it from the news? You haven't heard it from the news. So let's grow up.
So it sounds to me like what he's saying is the news isn't telling you the truth. They're lying to you and they're trying to trick you. You can't trust mainstream media, basically. And so you have to come to churches to get the real information because mainstream media is lying to you. I mean, this guy is a full-blown extremist. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but if you aren't, stick around because I have another clip coming out about him soon. I mean, I've talked about him a few times on my channel already anyways, but that is just that's untold amounts of disconnected from reality, man.
Heard it from the news. So let's grow up and realize that there was never a separation between church and state. That is not what our founding fathers intended. In fact, the signing of the Declaration was many preachers that caused themselves to come together and get involved in politics.
Actually, no. It was one single minister that signed the Declaration of Independence. And what was that he said a second ago?
There was never a separation between church and state. That is not what our founding fathers intended.
It is, in fact, what they intended, because we have letters from the Founding Fathers themselves explaining exactly what they intended, and there is a separation of church and state. It's being eroded currently by people like Hank. It feels like, at the moment, Christian nationalism is taking root. It's taking hold. We used to have those protections in place, but at this moment, the Supreme Court seems to be eroding those protections, little by little, day by day. We need to do our best to fight back against this, to the best of our ability. I know it doesn't feel like much, but the least we can do is vote, no matter what. If you don't feel like voting is important, then ask yourself why Elon Musk himself does. Ask yourself why Donald Trump himself, one man, went to the ballot box to vote for himself. Every single vote counts. Every single one. We can vote. We can phone bank for politicians. We can donate to their cause. We can donate to their campaigns. We have to do our best to drive Christian nationalism out of government. We have to, or it's going to take root.